In 1967, a single film was banned in 4 countries, praised by the Pope, and made its director so paranoid he slept with the only print under his bed. The 1960s gave us revolutions on screen most people have never even heard of. Think you know classic cinema? These 10 films will prove you wrong. Cléo, From 5 to 7, 1962. Most people think the French New Wave was all Godard and Truffaut. They're wrong. Agnes Varda's Cléo, From 5 to 7, released in 1962, is one of the most quietly radical films ever made, and almost nobody talks about it anymore. The entire movie unfolds in near real time. We follow a gorgeous Parisian pop singer named Cléo as she wanders the streets of Paris for 90 minutes, waiting for the results of a medical test that could change her life forever. That's it. That's the whole movie, and it is absolutely electrifying. Varda shot the film using a skeleton crew, guerrilla style, on the actual streets of Paris. No permits, no closed sets, real pedestrians wandering into frame, real traffic, real sunlight. She wanted the city to feel alive and unpredictable, and it does. Cléo walks through markets, cafes, parks, and sculpture gardens, and the camera follows her like a ghost. What starts as a portrait of vanity slowly peels back into something devastating. Cléo stops performing for the world and starts actually seeing it. The transformation is so subtle you almost miss it, and that's exactly the point. Critics at the time praised it, but it was overshadowed by the louder, flashier work of Varda's male contemporaries. Roger Ebert later called it one of the most perfect films ever made. Corinne Marchand, the lead, delivered a career performance that should have made her a global star. Instead, the film quietly slipped into art house obscurity. It earned modest returns at the box office and never got the wide audience it deserved. Varda herself said she made the film to explore what happens when a woman stops being looked at and starts looking. For a 1962 movie, that idea was decades ahead of its time. It still feels ahead of ours. The Bad Sleep Well, 1960. Here's a question. What happens when you give one of Japan's most fearless directors a story about corporate greed, poison, and the total collapse of morality? You get The Bad Sleep Well from 1960, directed by Akira Kurosawa, and somehow it's one of his least discussed masterpieces. Kurosawa took Shakespeare's Hamlet and dropped it right into the world of post-war Japanese corporate corruption. The result is a slow-burning thriller that will leave you furious by the end. Toshiro Mifune stars as a young executive who marries the daughter of a powerful businessman. But this isn't a love story, it's a revenge mission. Mifune's character has infiltrated the corporation to expose the men responsible for his father's death, which was staged to look like a voluntary act. Every scene drips with tension. Kurosawa frames the corporate boardrooms like battlefields, all sharp angles and deep shadows, and the performances are coiled tight like springs ready to snap. What makes this one sting is the ending. Kurosawa refused to give audiences the cathartic payoff they wanted. The system wins. The powerful stay powerful. Justice doesn't come. When the film premiered, Japanese critics were divided. Some called it Kurosawa's most cynical work. Others said it was his most honest. At the box office, it performed decently in Japan, but barely registered overseas. Western audiences were still catching up to Seven Samurai and Rashomon. This one got lost in the shuffle. It shouldn't have. Martin Scorsese has called it one of Kurosawa's most underrated films, and honestly, he's right. It plays like a prophecy of every corporate scandal we've seen since. Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, 1965. Imagine making a film so beautiful that the government of your own country decides to destroy you for it. That's exactly what happened to Sergei Parajanov with Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors in 1965. This Ukrainian film tells the story of 2 lovers from rival families in the Carpathian Mountains. A tale soaked in folklore, ritual, and heartbreak. It sounds simple. It is anything but. Parajanov shot this film like a fever dream. The camera spins, crashes through forests, plunges into rivers, and flies through fire. Colors explode off the screen. Traditional Hutzel music floods every frame. It doesn't feel like a 1960s movie. It feels like something pulled from another dimension entirely. When it premiered at the Mar del Plata Film Festival in Argentina, the audience gave it a 15-minute standing ovation. It won the top prize. International critics were stunned. Nobody had ever seen anything like it. Back home, the reaction was very different. Soviet authorities were immediately suspicious of Parajanov. The film celebrated Ukrainian identity with a passion that made Moscow uncomfortable. Parajanov became a target. Within a few years, he was arrested on fabricated charges and sentenced to 5 years of hard labor. His films were banned. His work was confiscated. He spent years in prison camps, and the Soviet film establishment tried to erase him from history entirely. It didn't work. The film survived through underground screenings and international prints. Today, directors like Francis Ford Coppola and Mikhail Vartanov have cited it as one of the most visually revolutionary films in cinema history. The Soviets tried to bury this movie and its creator. They failed spectacularly. Seconds, 1966. John Frankenheimer made a film in 1966 that was so far ahead of its time, audiences literally walked out of theaters. Seconds stars Rock Hudson in the role of his career, and almost nobody saw it. The film follows a middle-aged banker who is approached by a mysterious organization that offers him a second chance at life. They fake his death, give him full cosmetic reconstruction, and set him up with a brand new identity as a bohemian artist living in Malibu. Sounds like paradise, right? It is a nightmare. James Wong Howe, one of the greatest cinematographers who ever lived, shot this film with distorted wide-angle lenses that make every frame feel claustrophobic and wrong. Hudson's performance is devastating. He plays a man who got everything he thought he wanted and discovered it was hollow. The film is essentially about the lie of reinvention, the idea that you can escape yourself if you just change the packaging. When Seconds premiered at the Cannes Film Festival, the audience booed. Frankenheimer was reportedly so shaken he didn't speak to journalists for weeks. Paramount had no idea how to market it. Was it science fiction? Horror? Drama? They fumbled the release, and it vanished from theaters almost immediately. It lost money. Critics were mixed at best. But over the decades, something shifted. The film found its audience on late-night television and repertory screenings. Martin Scorsese championed it publicly. The Criterion Collection gave it a prestigious restoration. Today, it's considered one of the great paranoid thrillers of the 20th century. Rock Hudson himself called it the best work he ever did. In 1966, the world just wasn't ready. Carnival of Souls, 1962. What if I told you one of the most influential horror films ever made was shot for less than the price of a new car? Carnival of Souls came out in 1962, directed by Herc Harvey, an industrial filmmaker from Kansas who had never made a feature before and never made one again. The film follows a young woman named Mary who survives a car accident and moves to a new town to take a job as a church organist. But something is wrong. She keeps seeing a ghoulish, pale figure following her. She feels disconnected from the world around her. People stop noticing she exists. Harvey shot the film in 3 weeks on a budget of roughly $30,000, using a real abandoned pavilion at Saltaire in Utah as the central haunted location. The building is genuinely eerie on its own, and Harvey knew exactly how to use it. Candice Hilligoss, in the lead role, gives a performance that is equal parts fragile and fierce. She carries the entire film on her shoulders. When Carnival of Souls was released, distributors treated it like a cheap drive-in throwaway. It barely made any money. Critics ignored it entirely. But here's where the story gets wild. Over the next 3 decades, the film became one of the most important cult movies in history. George Romero has said it directly influenced Night of the Living Dead. David Lynch has acknowledged its impact on his work. The film's dreamlike atmosphere and its blurring of reality and death became a blueprint for an entire subgenre of psychological horror. All of that from a guy who spent his career making educational films about factory safety. Sometimes genius comes from the most unlikely places. The War Game, 1965. Peter Watkins made a film for the BBC in 1965 that was so terrifying they refused to broadcast it for 20 years. The War Game is a 47-minute docudrama that depicts the aftermath of a nuclear attack on Britain. Watkins used handheld cameras, non-professional actors, and a documentary style so convincing that viewers genuinely couldn't tell if it was real. The BBC commissioned it. The BBC watched it, and the BBC locked it in a vault. The film depicts firestorms, radiation sickness, mass panic, civil breakdown, and government failure with an unflinching brutality that feels more like war footage than fiction. Watkins did meticulous research, pulling data from Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and contemporary civil defense reports. Every statistic cited in the film is accurate. Every scenario depicted was considered plausible by nuclear strategists at the time. That's exactly why it was suppressed. The British government quietly pressured the BBC not to air it, arguing it could cause mass panic and undermine public confidence in the nation's defense strategy. Here is where it gets extraordinary. Despite never being broadcast, The War Game won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature in 1967. A fictional film made for television that was never even shown to a television audience won an Oscar. Watkins accepted the award, but publicly condemned the BBC and the British government for censorship. The film was finally broadcast in 1985, 20 years after it was made. Critics who saw it said it had only become more relevant with time. It remains one of the most powerful pieces of anti-war filmmaking ever produced, and the story of its suppression is almost as chilling as the film itself. Trou, 1960. Most people have never heard of Trou, and that's a crime against cinema. Jacques Becker's 1960 prison escape film is, minute for minute, one of the most gripping movies ever made. Becker based it on the true story of 5 men who attempted to tunnel out of La Santé prison in Paris. He cast one of the actual escapees, Jean Quehaudy, to play a version of himself. That's not dramatic license. That's a real man reenacting his own escape on camera. Becker films the escape with almost unbearable patience. You watch these men chip through concrete, hollow out floors, and navigate underground tunnels in near silence. There's no dramatic score, no Hollywood shortcuts. Every sound, every scrape, every breath feels magnified. The tension doesn't build, it compounds. By the final act, you are physically leaning forward. Becker understood that real suspense comes not from explosions, but from waiting. Tragically, Jacques Becker died just weeks after completing the film. He never saw it released. When it premiered, French critics were overwhelmed. Some called it the greatest prison film ever made. But it arrived in a crowded marketplace and failed to find a wide international audience. Over the decades, filmmakers have quietly passed it around like a sacred text. Jean-Pierre Melville called it perfect. Michael Mann has cited it as a direct influence. Criterion released a restoration that introduced it to a new generation. If you love heist films, if you love thrillers, if you love cinema that trusts its audience enough to sit in silence and sweat, you need this movie in your life. Becker's final gift to cinema deserves to be remembered. Targets, 1968. In 1968, a 25-year-old from Pittsburgh drove to a farmhouse with a cast of unknown actors, a budget scraped together from friends and family, and made a film that rewrote the rules of horror forever. But we're not talking about Night of the Living Dead. We're talking about the film that almost beat it to theaters. Targets, directed by a young Peter Bogdanovich, was released the same year and tackled something far more terrifying than zombies. It's about an ordinary man who snaps and begins picking off strangers with a rifle from a highway overpass, and later from behind the screen at a drive-in theater. Bogdanovich made this film for Roger Corman on a shoestring budget, with the condition that he use Boris Karloff for 2 days of shooting and incorporate footage from an older Corman picture. Those restrictions forced Bogdanovich to be wildly creative. He built a dual narrative. One thread follows an aging horror star, played by Karloff essentially as himself, who feels his brand of gothic terror has become irrelevant. The other follows the shooter, played with chilling calm by Tim O'Kelly. When the two stories collide at the drive-in climax, it's one of the most unsettling sequences of the entire decade. The film was released just months after real-world tragedies involving mass shootings, and Paramount pulled it from wide distribution almost immediately. It barely played in theaters. Reviews were strong but scarce. Over time, though, Targets gained a reputation as one of the most prophetic American films of its era. Bogdanovich proved with his very first feature that he was a filmmaker of extraordinary intelligence. The film asks a devastating question that somehow hits harder every single year. When real-life horror becomes this overwhelming, what's the point of monsters on a screen? Last Year at Marienbad, 1961. There's a 1961 film that invented an entire visual language, and most people don't even know its name. Last Year at Marienbad, directed by Alain Resnais with a screenplay by Alain Robbe-Grillet, is one of the most debated films in the history of cinema. A man approaches a woman at a grand Baroque hotel and insists they met the previous year. She says they didn't. He says they had an affair. She denies it. The film never tells you who is right. It never tells you anything for certain. Resnais shot the film in actual Baroque palaces and formal gardens, creating a world that feels frozen in time. The corridors stretch into infinity. Shadows fall at impossible angles. Characters stand like statues. The organ music drones and swells. It doesn't feel like watching a movie. It feels like walking through someone else's memory, a memory that might be a lie. Every frame is composed like a painting, and the editing fractures time so thoroughly that past, present, and imagination become indistinguishable. When it premiered at the Venice Film Festival, it won the Golden Lion, the top prize. Critics were split right down the middle. Some declared it a masterpiece of pure cinema. Others called it pretentious nonsense. Audiences walked out in droves at commercial screenings. The film made very little money, but its influence has been absolutely massive. Stanley Kubrick studied it obsessively before making The Shining. The hotel in The Shining echoes Marienbad's endless hallways, almost shot for shot. David Lynch, Peter Greenaway, and countless others have drawn from it. You might not enjoy Last Year at Marienbad, but you cannot deny its power. It's not a film you watch, it's a film that watches you. Chimes at Midnight, 1965. The #1 spot belongs to a film that was confiscated by its own studio, buried for decades, and nearly lost forever. Orson Welles made Chimes at Midnight in 1965 by cobbling together financing from Spanish and Swiss producers after every Hollywood studio turned him down. It's a Shakespeare adaptation, pulling from 5 different plays to tell the story of Sir John Falstaff, the great drunken knight, and his doomed friendship with Prince Hal. Welles himself played Falstaff, and he poured every ounce of his broken, brilliant soul into the role. The Battle of Shrewsbury sequence in this film is widely considered the greatest battle scene ever filmed. Welles shot it over weeks with a tiny army of extras, using rapid editing, low angles, mud, fog, and sheer chaos to create something that feels more visceral and real than anything in a $100 million blockbuster. Every major filmmaker who has staged a battle since has studied this sequence. It influenced Braveheart. It influenced Saving Private Ryan. It influenced everything. But the tragedy of Chimes at Midnight is Shakespearean in itself. Rights issues tangled the film in legal disputes for decades. Prints deteriorated. For years, the only versions available were muddy, badly dubbed transfers that made the film nearly unwatchable. Welles called Falstaff the role closest to his heart and said this was his finest work. Most critics who saw it agreed. When a full restoration finally arrived in 2015, 50 years after its release, the reaction was unanimous. This was the masterpiece Welles always said it was. He spent his whole life being told he peaked with Citizen Kane. He didn't. He peaked here, in a freezing field in Spain, covered in mud, playing a fat old knight nobody wanted to fund.